So what we just saw was archival footage of a cemetery located in East Berlin. This cemetery is called Wiesensee. And what is so important about Wiesensee is that it's actually one of the only Jewish cemeteries in Germany that's completely intact. At the rise of the Third Reich, many Jewish cemeteries were completely desecrated and destroyed. What's also impactful about Wiesensee is that when it was originally built, it was built mausoleum style, meaning that the bodies were going to be buried in the wall with blank graves that would later be filled in. So this cemetery itself was a promise. It was a promise that Jews were going to live in Germany forever, that they were going to continually have a place to return to. But instead what we have is we have an absence. We have a void. And during reunification, the cemetery was essentially abandoned. And so instead what we see are graves covered with foliage, emptiness, forgotten. Shortly before reunification, the West German government decided that they wanted to combine the histories of the Germans and the Jewish people, saying that these histories are inherently linked, that the history of Jewish people is inherently linked to the history of Germany itself. It was also going to be one of the first times that Germany ever acknowledged the Holocaust. Acknowledged the Holocaust and its effects on the German people and its absence of Jews living in Germany at the time. So in order to build this museum, they hosted a competition. Over 600 entries were submitted, and the entry that was chosen was by a lesser-known architect named Daniel Liebeskind. This is his building. Now, the building is in the shape of a lightning bolt. It's affectionately called the Blitz. But actually what it is a fractured Star of David. So the architecture itself speaks to the history that's being held in this building. But what is most important about this architecture is not this itself, but what runs through it. So every meeting of the fracture of the star, you have an empty space, which is more easily seen in this diagram. So the line that runs through interrupts every twist and turn of the building. And in these spaces is an empty room. There's no display, there's no exhibit. And the only way to access it is when you're walking across the exhibits, and you can only see it from a bridge, except for one. This is called the memory void. And visitors are invited to enter the room. There's one door, and you enter it and you exit it. Visitors are invited to make a circular loop through the room. It's a vacuous space. There's only one light source. And as you're walking, what you're walking on top of is actually an art piece by an Israeli artist named Menashe Kadishman. And what it is it's 1,000 pieces of metal carved in the shape of screaming faces. So you're walking on faces, the metal is clanging together, it is echoing in this vacuous chamber, and you're exiting from one door. So when we're talking about memorializations, when we're talking about voids, we're talking about what is the best way to have a memorial. And James Young would actually say that the absence of a building is the best kind of memorialization. He advocated that instead of actually building Liebeskind's museum, what would have been a better way would have just had the competition extend for forever. That the actual discussion of memorialization is a better way to memorialize than actually building the space. That a void is better when we're talking about an absence. When we're also talking about memorialization, we're talking about the contrast between history and memory. Theorist Andrea Hoyesen says that history was this promise that there was going to always be a future, that everything that we did was moving towards this pinnacle of morality or this pinnacle of betterment for humankind. But when you have an event like the Holocaust, that's completely shattered. The promise of history is broken. So what do you do with that? You replace it with memory. You create this culture of memory that says that I can't promise you the future, but I can promise that there is something to look back on. And that's what we have in our memorials and our memorialization. It's a different kind of void. It's a void of context. There's another memorial located in central Berlin, and it's called the Memorial to the Murdered Jews of Europe. And what it is it's a grid of cement blocks situated in a square on a sloping hill. Visitors are invited to enter and to explore the grid. There's various paths that one can choose, but there is no central point. So as you walk, you're greeted by cement blocks on either side. It is disorienting. There seems to be no end. It is continuous. So what I was fascinated by was, how do people interact with voided spaces? How do people interact with spaces that are void of context? And an artist in Berlin had the same idea as well. His name is Kyna McClenaghan, and he created this project called the Holocaust. As he was seeing that people were posting on social media selfies of themselves at this memorial. So he decided to give them back their context. He took these photos that he was seeing on social media and photoshopped out the memorial, and instead photoshopped in images from the Holocaust. Now, you could have your photo removed from the art project, but what you had to do was you had to send the artist an email at undoucheme.de with a letter explaining why you had taken the photo in the first place. This is an example of one of the first letters the artist ever received. And what is so shocking about this letter is the lack of apology, the defensiveness, the explaining that it was a joke. It wasn't intended to be harmful. It was unintentional. The artist has also invited people to leave their own comments in response to the art project. And this was one of the comments I found to be the most impactful. And it says, "These are selfishies, selfishies." And when you think about that, and you think about the way that we interact with memorial spaces, and you think about the way that we interact with voids, when you think about the way that we interact with this particular space, it's interesting to think that we are filling the spaces with ourselves. We are filling the emptiness with ourselves. It's not about the memorial, it's about us. There are over 250 Holocaust museums and memorials all over the world. This is a map of all of them. And when you look at this, you realize that this is a conversation we think is worth having. This is an event that is worth remembering. This is an event that we say we are never going to forget, that we will never allow to happen again. But when we have that, and then we have the way that we interact with these spaces, I wonder if we're remembering for the sake of remembering. And I wonder if we're remembering to remember, but we don't even remember what we have to remember in the first place. What I argue is, instead, we need to remember the history, we need to take the memory, and we need to put the context back in these spaces. Because it is only with the acknowledgement of the past that we can shape our present, and it's the only acknowledgement of that that we can shape our future. Thank you.